purpose of this short video is to understand some of the basic things that you need to know as a teacher before you start teaching Illustrator. We're going to look at the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop, ask students to find out about bitmaps and vectors. We're going to ask you to talk to your students about research in the design process. And we're going to look at how drawing, something that everybody can do, is a really important part of the Illustrator workflow. Here's my top 4 tips for teaching Adobe Illustrator in the classroom. Tip 1. Illustrator versus Photoshop. When to use Illustrator. Even though these two programs are similar and you can do similar things with both programs, Illustrator is the best tool for creating graphic elements. My advice would be to use Illustrator when designing logos, illustrations, and graphic elements, which can then be used in a variety of designs and programs. Photoshop is traditionally used for editing photographs and imagery and retouching existing imagery. Tip 2. Vectors and bitmaps. What's the difference? It's really important your students know the basics before they start. Vector files, such as .ai files or EPS files, consist of drawings made up from a series of lines and points. So looking at the NASA logo, on the right-hand side, we can see an artwork version of the logo, which is just lines and points. This means that when a logo is drawn, it can be used in a very small instance or on a large scale with no loss of quality. Bitmap file, however, such as a JPEG, means that when an image is created, it's made up of pixels. When these pixels are scaled up, a loss of quality occurs, and an image becomes pixelated. Tip 3. Design influence, the importance of research for your students. My advice when starting any classroom-based project is to start by getting your students to look at existing design work. Looking at things like graphic art and infographics, where data is produced and visualized in an interesting way, and detailed illustration, where sometimes drawings are scanned in and vectorized using Adobe Illustrator. Tip 4. Illustrator and hand skills. It's really important to get students to use their drawing skills and to know that it is part of the Illustrator workflow. It's always great to work by hand and not get too caught up in using the computer for all your designs. One great classroom exercise is to use students' hand drawings, which are then scanned and vectorized in Adobe Illustrator. This piece of work by New York-based illustrator Jessica Heach shows off her hand-drawn skills, but also her ability to use Adobe Illustrator to enhance those drawings. This work by myself shows an image that I already had, that I drew over and then vectorized, creating a logo. These original sketches were first drawn by hand, then scanned, and would then be drawn in Adobe Illustrator. It's really important to explain these basic things to students before you really get going on any graphics or design project. So to recap on my top 4 tips for Illustrator, we looked at Illustrator and Photoshop and discussed why it's best to use one or the other programs in any given circumstance. Tip 2, we looked at vectors and bitmaps and talked about what's the difference. Tip 3, we looked at design influence and the importance of research. Tip 4, we looked at Illustrator and hand skills and how hand drawing can play a great part in drawing great vectors.